run remained crucial, but increasingly the risk of a box office failure could be underwritten by the insurance policy of the VHS and DVD markets, in the same way that TV licensing had long been underwriting cinema. Nowadays, falling DVD sales and the rise of pirate discs are jointly blamed for the movie industry's imminent collapse, which is apparently just around the corner. It isn't, and anyone who worries that the majors, who do the most vociferous whining about these subjects, are actually cash-strapped needs their head examined. Suffice to say that Hollywood currently sees home viewing sales as a market worth protecting, and only the very naive or nostalgic believe that the financial future of the film industry lies solely or even primarily with cinemas. As for Waterworld, far from becoming what Variety called the disaster which the film industry needed to start a serious course correction, it actually ended up demonstrating just how unsinkable the big-budget event movie template really was if backers were willing and able to play the long game. Cleopatra took over a decade to pay for itself. Waterworld probably managed the same feat in less than 5 years. And although no one likes to admit it, we probably have the strangely twisted template of Waterworld to thank for the existence of Titanic, which went on to become the biggest selling and, stop me if you've heard this one, most expensive movie of all time. Like Waterworld, Titanic was a waterlogged production with a dodgy script which ran massively over budget and which was widely predicted during its ever-expanding production period to be a lavish vanity project disaster in the making. As we all know, it went on to make $1.8 billion worldwide and is currently being digitally dicked around for re-release in 2012 in eye-bogglingly commemorative 3D, more of which later. Yippee. The fact that Titanic is not a great film is somewhat beside the point. Its world-beating success speaks for itself. What is important is that it was allowed to be made only a couple of years after Costner's alleged water-related flop, with Fox and Paramount jointly shouldering the burden of its out-of-control costs. In what turned out to be a terrifically smart move, Paramount took the domestic rights for a capped sum of $60 million, with Fox handling worldwide in return for picking up the rest of the production tab. They figured the excess cost couldn't be much more than $40 million. Oh! As total costs spiraled from $100 million to $200 million, Paramount found themselves in the enviable position of having paid a fixed rate for a film whose widely reported budget just kept growing and growing, with headline-grabbing results. Fox, meanwhile, were left wondering if Titanic's international box office could get close to matching the $167 million made by Waterworld outside the US, which would at least go some way toward recouping the whopping $140 million they had accidentally ended up sinking into the film just to get the damn thing finished. The only thing that kept their hopes afloat was the fact that Waterworld was a terrible film. Titanic couldn't possibly be any worse, and it still managed to turn a buck. If Titanic was any good at all, they might just get away with it. Nearly $2 billion later, some of us were still wondering why Titanic didn't become fish tar after all. With hindsight, it's easy to be blasé about Cameron's canny audience manipulation, but there's just so much wrong with Titanic, at least from the perspective of an old fart like myself, that its success still gets under my skin. It's bothered me for years. Some months after the film's record-breaking release, I found myself in the company of Paramount boss Sherry Lansing and felt impelled to tell her just how grievously the film had failed in my all-important eyes. To her infinite credit, she listened patiently and politely while I explained how Cameron had dropped the ball with a film that was about to win 11 Oscars, including Best Director and Best Picture. Here's what I said. First up, the big problem with Titanic is that it isn't A Night to Remember. Whereas the latter is essentially a film about Englishness in crisis and is therefore interesting, the former is a film about Hollywood in hysterics and is therefore annoying. In A Night to Remember, the band played on. In Titanic, Celine Dion sang. Any questions? Next, the stars. According to James Cameron's honking screenplay, Rose is a naive, innocent Rose, get it? Who, whilst being dragged across oceans by her caddish fiancé, whose money will secure her family's future, falls for the altogether more worldly-wise Jack, who has spent the last few years whoring his way around Europe with one-legged prostitutes. Sadly, while Kate Winslet has the appearance of a woman of substance, Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't look old enough to be out on his own. You don't want Rose to shag him, you want her to adopt him. DiCaprio was, of course, cast as Jack on the strength of his starring role in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. In Titanic, he would effectively reprise this doomed pretty boy shtick, playing another floppy-fringed upstart with the hots for a socially unobtainable prom queen type who would go weak at the sight of his unsheathed rapier. The only real difference would be that, whereas Juliet kills herself after Romeo kicks the bucket, Rose's heart would go on and on and on and on. Then there's the script itself. Shakespeare, it ain't. If the iceberg hadn't sunk the bloody boat, then the dialogue would surely have done so. Among Titanic's more memorably awful lines, one stands out in my mind. It's the moment when, as the butt end of the sinking boat starts to creak up out of the water and various CGI souls fall dramatically off the deck, Rose grabs Jack and says helpfully, "This is where we first met." It's a line that makes me want to stand up and scream, "Yes, I know that's where you fucking met. I've been watching the movie for the last 2 hours, as has everyone else, and we all watched you meet there. And frankly, if I'd known you were going to come up with crap like that at a moment like this, then you would both have been better off throwing yourself to an icy death in the first place." All of which brings me to the crux of the Titanic problem, which is this. From the minute the ship hits the iceberg, I don't care what happens to Jack and Rose. All I can think about is the army of jolly Irish dancing types who are now drowning below decks, along with all the other badly sketched incidental caricatures whose lives seem so much less important to the filmmakers. I don't care if Jack drowns or if Rose goes on to have loads of grandchildren only to return years later to drop expensive jewellery into the sea. I just don't care, and I'll care even less in 3D. Sherry Lansing, God bless her, sat through all the above with a look of serene amusement on her face, and then, when I'd finished, she put down her glass of chilled mineral water, folded her extraordinarily elegant hands under her chin, smiled charmingly and said, "The problem with you is that you're not a teenage girl." And she was right. In every possible way. The fact is that I am not, and never have been, a teenage girl. Consequently, I did not buy into the Rose and Jack love story in the way that armies of teenage girls were doing all around the world. And not doing just once. The real genius of Titanic was that its core audience went to see it time and time again. When you start analysing the mind-boggling box office figures for the movie, you very quickly realise that repeat viewing played a significant factor in the film's success. As the makers of the Twilight series have since discovered, the teen girl demographic may be hard to crack, but if you succeed, the rewards of their eternal devotion are substantial. To all intents and purposes, Bella and Edward are the latter-day Jack and Rose. The difference is that the Twilight movies don't cost $200 million to make. Maybe that's why I like them so much more than Titanic. As for myself, I would have ditched Jack and married Billy Zane, who has better hair, all of it wigs, and who seemed to be the only actor in Titanic who really understood the film's cheesy B-movie roots. Plus, anyone who has David Warner for a butler is okay in my book. But the real question is whether Titanic could have broken even without the teen girl support network. Would it have done all right if Kate and Leo hadn't captured the pubescent imagination? Of course it would. Why? Because it was a really expensive event movie featuring huge special effects of the kind that just don't lose money anymore. For a year before the film hit the theatres, the papers had been full of its gargantuan budgetary requirements. The casting of Winslet had sparked a press furore which some have compared to the search for Scarlet hoo-ha that accompanied Gone with the Wind. And the promise of watching a really big boat sink in glorious widescreen detail had all the spectacular allure of watching a really big boat go belly up in Irwin Allen's The Poseidon Adventure, cost $5 million, US gross $93 million, or watching a really big building burn in Irwin Allen's The Towering Inferno, cost $14 million, US gross $116 million, the latter of which had also laid the template for Titanic's shared liability co-production, with Fox and Warner splitting the bill. The fact is that even if Titanic had zero romantic appeal, it still would have made its money back, eventually. For proof, look no further than Pearl Harbor, which gives us a unique insight into what could have happened to Titanic if it had turned out to be really rubbish. For in the end, what is Michael Bay's monstrosity if not a cack-handed remake of James Cameron's hit? Just look at the key ingredients. Historical tragedy? Check. Sinking boats? Check. English Rose actress? Check. American hunks? Check. Awful pop theme song? Check. Massive expense? Check. Engaging love story? Just think of the business Pearl Harbor could have done if Michael Bay had shown any genuine talent for putting recognizable human emotions on screen, if he was anything more than a peddler of grand-scale mechanical porn. Bay admitted that some people didn't get the love story in Pearl Harbor, but it still took $450 million worldwide. Imagine how much more it could have taken if those people had actually liked it. The difference between Pearl Harbor and Titanic is that, for all its faults, Titanic really worked for the devoted section of the audience who loved the movie and went to see it loads of times. These were the people who turned it from a surefire investment into a runaway success. These are the people to whom the producers owe a debt of gratitude, the people who made Titanic the most successful movie of all time, until Avatar. But make no mistake, without them, the movie would still have recouped its costs in the end. In the worst case scenario, if Titanic had been viewed as utter crap by everyone who saw it, it still would have been Pearl Harbor, the prequel, or Waterworld Part 2. And, as we have seen, in financial terms, that's not the very worst after all. Event movies no longer flop. Nowadays, they just underperform. In fact, for an expensive movie to really break the bank in the current marketplace, it has to be a genuine non-event. And the biggest non-events around have a horrible tendency to be comedies. There's an age-old maxim that laughter is priceless, but comedy should be cheap, and nowhere is this truer than in the cinema. Time and again, filmmakers have fallen flat on their faces by imagining that there's something inherently amusing about extravagant expense. There isn't. Blowing up aircraft carriers and sinking huge boats may be fun, but it's not funny. Crucial difference. If audiences pay to see a filmmaker spending hundreds of millions of dollars doing something really stupid, like Costner with Waterworld, then they don't want to laugh with the movie, they want to laugh at it. It is significant that over the course of a career which has included horror films, sci-fi romps, historical epics, literary adaptations, war movies, action adventures, and even a ghostly romance, the only time Steven Spielberg has come genuinely unstuck was when he decided to make a really expensive comedy. In some ways, his bloated Second World War farrago 1941 can be seen as a companion piece to Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, a film which takes a historical tragedy, America's bloody war with Japan, and turns it into a dreary farce. Both movies are bloated, baggy, boring, fantastically ill-judged, bum-numbingly long, and ludicrously wasteful in terms of dollars spent for enjoyment had. The only real difference between these two stinkers is that Spielberg wanted his audience to laugh, while Bay wanted them to cry. Both directors failed badly in their respective endeavours, but whereas Bay still scored a financial hit by virtue of his movie's non-comic event status, Spielberg took a bath because nothing sinks faster than an unfunny comedy, regardless of how much cash you throw at it. Incidentally, when I raised the spectre of 1941 in an interview with Spielberg himself, he conceded that extravagance had indeed got the better of him, but insisted that the film had not lost money in the long run, it had merely underperformed in the short term. A quick glance at the list of money-losing non-event failures of the past 25 years reveals unfunny comedy as the killer ingredient every time. In 1987, the aforementioned Ishtar, a romantic comedy in which Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman play lousy lounge singers stumbling into a web of Middle Eastern intrigue, proved that spending $51 million in the pursuit of cheap jokes really was no laughing matter. Just over a decade later, Beatty would star in another money-hemorrhaging failure, the middle-aged sex comedy Town and Country, which proved rather less welcome than a dose of the clap. Finally released 3 years after production began, the film's ever-spiralling budget hit a reported $90 million, but it managed to gross less than $7 million in the US, committing the threefold sins of A, costing far too much, B, not being spectacular, and C, trying to be funny. A lethal combination. It is arguable that comic misjudgment was the undoing of the 90s action comedy flop Hudson Hawk, which racked up bills of $70 million, some of which was reportedly spent on teams of special effects men who laboured to fix Bruce Willis's receding hair. If the film had been